All right, 7 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. Welcome to the third and final webinar of It's Within Our Scope Gender Inclusive Practice Panel Series. This webinar will be focusing on caring for transgender and gender diverse clients across the lifespan. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and will be made available on AOTA's YouTube channel. Also, the closed caption is enabled, so attendees can turn on their captioning on their own devices if needed. While this webinar does not count for CE credits, you will receive contact hours for your participation through email sometime this week. First, I want to introduce the webinar panel facilitators. We are the practice engagement and capacity building capstone students. My name is Bree Guillory. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm completing my OTD degree at Boston University.
And I am Lily Rafalski. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm completing my OTD at Emory and Henry College.
Next, we would like to acknowledge and thank the Diversity, Equity, Justice, Access, and Belonging staff who provided the PowerPoint slides that you see today. We also wanted to thank our mentors, Farlisha Gibbs-Lyons and Angela Warren, who helped organize the webinars and are also moderating the chat. We wanted to go over the outline for the webinar. First, we'll go over webinar professionalism, rules of engagement and learning, objectives. Next, we'll introduce the panelists, then facilitate a Q&A. And then the last 10 to 15 minutes will be reserved for Q&A from attendees. So please feel free to add your questions in the chat, and we'll try our best to get to them all within those last 10 minutes. And then we'll finish off with some closing remarks. So we celebrate and are dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We acknowledge lived experiences and pronouns and integrating cultural humility. This webinar is for everyone to participate to their comfort level, and attendee input is encouraged and invited. So please take a moment to look through the rules of engagement. I'll go over a few of them. The purpose of the webinar is to facilitate growth and discovery. Inappropriate comments are cause for immediate disconnect from the webinar, as respectful verbal and written communication is expected. Conversation within this webinar will be honored as confidential to provide a safe space for honest and transparent discussion. What's said here stays here, and what you learn here leaves here. As mentioned, this session will be recorded for educational purposes. And lastly, every individual is entitled to their own perspectives, vision, and opinion, and this will be a judgment-free space. And in this webinar, you will hear from 4 occupational therapy practitioners who are currently working with transgender and gender diverse individuals across the lifespan. You will learn ways occupational therapy practitioners can support neurodivergent TGD clients, how to support transgender and gender diverse youth and promote an inclusive environment, and how to support TGD older adults and provide gender affirming care.
Sorry. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panelists. First up, we have Tamora Amin Arsala, who uses they, he pronouns. Tay is an occupational therapist and a DEI advocate that lives just north of Boston, Massachusetts. They are a part-time lecturer at Tufts University, as well as serving as the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Justice, and Anti-Racism Coordinator at Waring School in Beverly, Massachusetts. Tay's professional interests and research agenda focus on the intersection of occupational therapy, disability, sexual orientation, and gender identity. They currently serve as the state delegate for Massachusetts to AOTA's Representative Assembly and have previously held leadership roles in the network for LGBTQIA+ concerns in occupational therapy. Next up, we have Carly Ashcroft, who uses they, them pronouns. Carly is an occupational therapist practicing in adolescent residential mental health. They serve as a board member for the network of LGBTQIA+ concerns in occupational therapy and are passionate about promoting education about OT's role in queer and trans physical and mental health care. Next up, we have Jess Baza de Garcia, who uses they, them pronouns. Jess is an occupational therapist and an OT researcher. Jess holds a BS in psychology from the former University of the Sciences in Philadelphia and a Master's of Occupational Therapy from Bay Path University. They have clinical experience in community-based occupational therapy, pediatric outpatient work, and mental health. They have research experience in advancing inclusivity, promoting neurodivergent relational and sexual health, and exploring ways to overcome community participation barriers for marginalized populations. Jess is dedicated to empowering individuals and creating positive change through their research, advocacy, and mentorship efforts. Jess is an enthusiastic advocate for inclusivity, equality, and belonging, and empowerment in the fields of occupational therapy and research. They currently work as a consultant for various projects to increase accessibility and inclusivity in contexts such as workplaces and community events. And then last, we have Devlin New, who uses they, he pronouns. Dev is a queer and gender fluid occupational therapist living in Ithaca, New York. Dev obtained their combined bachelor's and master's degree in human occupation and occupational therapy from Deauville College, where they fiercely advocated for diversity, equity, and inclusion within and outside the profession of OT. Dev is passionate about amplifying the voices of LGBTQIA+ individuals, educating others on the diverse needs of members of the LGBTQIA+ community on social media as the Rainbow OT, serving on the leadership team for the network of LGBTQ+IA concerns in occupational therapy, and facilitating action regarding change for improving equity, inclusion, and the quality of life for those within the LGBTQIA+ community. Dev recently transitioned to a full-time faculty as an assistant professor at Ithaca College and is looking forward to continuing this work. Dev recently co-authored Chapter 12 in AOTA Press's Trauma, Occupation, and Participation, and Chapter 10 in Sexuality and Intimacy. So we are going to start our questions with Tay. First up, we're going to start with a question we're going to ask everybody, which is, Tay, what is your role in your workplace and how does your job intersect with working with transgender and gender diverse individuals?
So I feel like many queer folk that have jobs, I have many jobs. So I have a couple different roles. I am a part-time lecturer at Tufts at the moment. I'm not going to go too much into that though, because it's part-time lecturer, that's pretty self-explanatory. But I also, as the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Justice, and Anti-Racism chair at a school up here on the North Shore of Massachusetts, I basically see my job, even though I'm not working under the title of an occupational therapist, I see my job as really working on educational access for any number of minoritized youth, whether it be racial minority, gender minority, sexual minority. And so my role there is really to try and make sure that all of our students at this middle and high school have access to their education and aren't being prevented from that access through any sort of discrimination, bias, anything like that. And I actually think that as an occupational therapy practitioner, we have sort of like an edge on this role, because I really do get to think about like how are these students education and access to education being impacted by what they're facing, both at a larger community level and interpersonal relationships as well. I'm also a health teacher there, but that's a side thing.
Awesome. Yeah. So talking about schools, what advice would you give to schools facing anti-trans or legislation and policies right now?
So I have a couple of different pieces of advice, I think, and this goes for schools, I think, at all different levels, whether it be grade school, middle school, high school, or even universities. The first would be that I think in this era where we've got a lot of that legislation coming out, to make sure that you're doing the research on the specifics of all of the laws that are coming out, because sometimes we sort of have these laws that come out and people will say like, oh, this is scoping and it's going to prevent us from doing any sort of care. And I think really, if you look at a lot of the laws, they're very specific. Like a lot of anti-trans laws focus more on they're like anti-medical transition, but have nothing to do with social transition. Or there are like DEI laws that target very specific areas of DEI. And so I think doing research on those laws and then sort of working around those areas to still provide whatever you can is really important, because there still is place for all of this work we're doing. I also think affirmation can take many forms for our gender diverse students. And so I think sort of once you figure out what is still legal, how can you still affirm? And affirm can be like a very big thing to a very small thing. And I think that's really important. And then sort of education, continued advocacy. If there are any legislators that are actively against these or are actively promoting these anti-trans laws, work on advocacy against them.
Thank you. So how does your school create a safe and inclusive environment for your transgender and gender diverse youth?
So I'll be talking here about specifically the middle and high school I work at. And I'll use like quotation safer rather than just safe, because even just working there, I know it's not completely safe for all the students as much as we try. So as much of a safer experience as we can. And we sort of do this from multiple prongs. One of the major parts of my role is education. So I sort of take that community-based approach of educating faculty on one, like a lot of basics around gender identity, so that a lot of these faculty that might not even understand some of the basics, like, oh, why are people using like they them as pronouns? Why are people using them as pronouns? Things like that, making sure that the faculty understand just at that base level what's going on, so we can have that common vocabulary, and then sort of helping to provide deeper dives for the faculty as well. We also do education for the students, and this tends to be more in, I'm going to call more fun, interactive ways. That's not just like the onus of that the faculty face of you have to provide for your students, but making sure that all of these school experiences are really worked in together and fun. So we try to do like fun experiences, like we participate in pride parades, we do Pride Month events, we do sort of different things all throughout the year that really highlight a lot of like queer joy. And I think that's really important for getting our students to have that safer sense. But on top of that, we also do, when something comes up that's not necessarily a positive, and maybe a student is facing like any sort of transphobia against them, we also bring them in and work with them on figuring out, okay, now that this event has occurred, how can we make you feel safe in the school again? Not from, and then also address it with whoever the people that did that was. And it's never from a like negative discipline based place. It's all about education and then restoration too. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. We're gonna like swerve a little bit. What does addressing sex and intimacy issues look like throughout the lifespan for occupational therapy practitioners?
Yeah, so I think that can look like a lot of different things. I know a couple of us here worked on the Sex and Intimacy textbook that came out this year through AOTA Press. But I really think you can approach it across the lifespan in a lot of different ways. That was the chapter I worked on in the textbook, was the across the lifespan development. If I'm looking at the courses I teach, or the course I teach at Tufts, I really focus that I teach the emerging practice course. So there, I really try to encourage students to either start looking into sex and intimacy across the lifespan through some of the projects we do, or even if it's not a focus of their work, make sure that sex and intimacy are still a consideration on top of gender, on top of sexual orientation in everything they do. A lot of what I try to do is also just sort of break down any preconceptions and biases people may have. So we're not stuck in this like heterosexist viewpoint of only thinking about sex and intimacy from a cisgender man, cisgender woman perspective, but sort of broadening that to make sure that we're thinking of all permutations of sexual intimacy, sex and intimacy. And then at my other job again, in my DEI role, actually in my health teacher role, I also teach some of the sex ed there. And I try to focus on like laying that groundwork where that we're doing sex ed with the students, and it is all going to be inclusive, because I don't want to have them relearn something later on because they weren't taught about inclusivity in the first place.
That's awesome. And I'll have one last question. What are some of, you mentioned small affirmations that you guys do in the schools. What are some of those examples of small affirmations?
Ooh, okay. Um, it's one of those things that I think it's a little bit of everything. It's really just how you treat people. Some of the small affirmations I like doing is, I think small compliments can go a long way. I think even just talking to someone, even if it is not like, if some of my students who are exploring their gender and things like that may feel uncomfortable sometimes talking with some of the faculty, and so just keeping my door open. I think even having the door open and offering that opportunity is an affirmation of sorts. And I don't know. I think it's all those little day-to-day interactions that are the small affirmations. And just letting all the students know that I see them for who they are, or for who they are in this moment.
That's so great. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to Bree.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question is for Carly. Carly, I'm gonna ask you the same first question. What is your role in the workplace, and how does your job intersect with caring for transgender and gender diverse individuals?
So hearing that Tay has like 6 jobs, that makes me feel like I'm dropping the ball a little bit. So I work as one of 2 occupational therapists at an intensive residential treatment program, which is abbreviated as IRTP, for adolescents with mental health struggles. Our IRTP is part of the organization called NFI Massachusetts, and we're located in Westborough, Massachusetts. So the adolescents that I work with are ages 13 through 19, all of whom have some sort of history of mental illness, including like self-injurious behaviors, suicide attempts, severe traumas, things like that. And because we are the only co-ed IRTP for adolescents in the state, we get a lot of, well, not a lot of, we get all of the trans and non-binary youth who are getting services through the Department of Mental Health at that level of care. So yeah, the ultimate goal for our adolescents is not even necessarily anything to do with gender identity or sexuality or things like that. But I think we all know as OTs that those things impact our physical and mental health. And especially in the time of adolescence, when just generally it's like a time of exploration, identity exploration, and it's a time when a lot of mental health diagnoses do emerge. Giving these adolescents who are trans, non-binary, or might be exploring different identities, being able to take that into consideration and think, how is that affecting your relationship with yourself, with your parents, with your school, all of those different things.
Thank you. And just going off of the point that you made about gender playing a role in your interventions, can you talk about how it intersects and how you administer assessments and go about your intervention?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the first 30 days that a client is with us, so we're like a more longer term facility when it comes to mental health. A lot of people are familiar with like the inpatient hospitalization like level of care, like length of stay, which is usually like a couple of weeks. We have our clients usually on average anywhere from 4 to 6 months, but up to as long as they need. So we have a long time to spend. And in the first month, we do our assessments. We do the adolescent adult sensory profile. We do the Allen's cognitive level screen, and just like an overall occupational profile. The occupational profile is definitely where I get most of my information regarding things about gender. Like it's my opportunity to ask them like, how do you identify? Like, tell me things about you, obviously not just related to gender, but to all the different areas of occupation. And so I get to see, okay, so-and-so client is trans, and they told me that they have a really, really difficult time with showering and with hygiene. So I might consider, okay, how could some gender dysphoria be impacting their engagement with that activity in particular? And so interventions that we do for showering might be, okay, when you are going to the bathroom, like you can have somebody support you in covering up the mirror, or maybe you're going to shower with a bathing suit on, or maybe you're going to shower with the lights off, like all these different things that we can come up with to help mitigate something like gender dysphoria for hygiene, for example. Thinking about the information that we get from the adolescent adult sensory profile, taking into consideration how different clothing preferences might align with a person's gender expression and identity. I'm thinking about things like chest binders, which compress chest tissue to give people like a more a flatter looking chest. For somebody who scores really high in sensory avoiding or sensory sensitive processing patterns, figuring out like, hey, is a binder going to be comfortable for you long term? How can we incorporate more breaks? All of those types of things. Another interesting thing that I like to keep like in the top of my mind when it comes to the sensory profile is the convergence between neurodivergence, specifically folks on the autism spectrum, and trans and non-binary individuals. So I'm thinking, sorry, I'm trying to remember the exact statistics. Trans individuals are 3 to 6 times more likely to be autistic than cisgender individuals. And we all know that autism is a diagnosis that comes with it, sensory sensitivities or all of those things. So just keeping that on the radar as well. But yeah, there are a lot of different things in all of the different areas. I would say safety management in relation to safety towards self mostly, because we're talking about things like self-harm. So how does your relationship with your gender identity impact how you view yourself, or how is your gender impacting your relationship with XYZ people in your life?
Thank you for explaining that and providing some considerations. How would you recommend for practitioners to maybe recognize signs of gender dysphoria, especially with youth?
I think one of the biggest things is to ask. One of the things that I have learned the most, I think just as in any setting, is like you never want to assume anything about your clients. So like I might see in that initial occupational profile, so-and-so said to me, showering is really difficult. I know they are also trans, and it might have nothing to do with the fact that they are trans. They might not experience gender dysphoria when they are showering. So I think asking like, do you experience dysphoria? And also on the flip side, what Tay had mentioned earlier about euphoria also, what are the things that make you feel good in different aspects? And when you're, I don't know, doing XYZ. So I think asking, how does your gender euphoria and dysphoria impact you? How does it show up? And then 2, just being noticeable of different things, because it can be like a sensitive topic for folks. So like building rapport over time, it's not something that I'd probably ask about on day 1. It might be month 3 that we finally get to talking about dysphoria. But that is a tricky one, because I don't think there's like a cookie cutter answer for people. I think each trans person experiences dysphoria and euphoria in a different way.
Thank you. The next question is, what recommendations do you have for practitioners who work with youth trying to incorporate gender affirming care into their practice settings? Yeah,
so I think one of the biggest things is just modeling inclusivity and modeling like that you are a relatively safe person for youth. So like always introducing yourself not only to your clients, but to other coworkers and in meetings, like, you know, my name is Carly, I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the occupational therapist here. So modeling that over time, talking about what Tay had mentioned again earlier about like those subtle affirmations, like having inclusive signage in where you work can make such a huge difference for a kid who is looking for that. Like they will notice, oh my gosh, like my OT has like a they them pin, or, you know, they have a rainbow outside their door. And I think too, speaking again on the assumptions piece, like making sure that all of your clients of any gender have access to the same things, like not assuming that like, hey, little Tommy, he's only going to want to play with these trucks. Like, it's a really basic example, but like, we don't know what our clients are going to prefer until we ask them and we give them the opportunities to access the things available to them. So giving choice, I think, is also very important, and choice without our own bias thrown into it. Because like if we only offer XYZ thing, they can only choose those things. I think that's important. Yeah.
Thank you. How do you provide education on a relationship between gender and mental health, especially when you're talking to caregivers or parents?
Yeah. We have currently and have had in the past, I think, a number of parents or guardians or family members or what have you that we've gotten, my kid is here for mental health treatment. They're not here to talk about gender. They're not here to talk about the gay stuff. And I think the way that our team has addressed that is like with the evidence of like, especially for trans youth, that like one of the biggest deterrents for suicide is just being accepting, and especially using chosen name and pronouns. So showing evidence that's like not from us, like we're not saying this, it's like those scientist people said it over there, and just continuing to do, what like I know to be the ethical and evidence-based thing, which is I will always use the name and the pronouns that my client tells me to use for them. I think too, though, it's also important, like going back to the previous question about making sure that you're like inclusive and safe. Always asking the question too of like, where and when are this name and these pronouns okay for me to use for you? Can I use them in your meetings with your parents? Is it okay to use it during visits or whatever it is? Because I think it's important to respect the needs and wants in that aspect too. And a person's identity affects them whether or not they're LGBTQ or trans or whatever it is. Like every person every day interacts with their own identity and portrays that in a certain way. Everyone has a name, everyone has pronouns, so like trying to normalize it, I think a little bit more too, that like, hey, mom or dad, like you like to be called mom and dad when so-and-so talks to you, like that's how, so like always relating it back to like the individual experiences. And I think normalizing is important too.
Thank you so much for that. I'll go ahead and pass it over to Lily.
Thank you.
Awesome. All right, Jess, I'm going to start you off with the same question. What is your role in your workplace, and how does your job intersect with caring for transgender and gender diverse individuals?
Yeah, so I'm a little bit like Tay in that I have a bunch of things I do too. And one of those things is the scientist people that Carly was talking about. So in my current work, I mostly do OT research with Laurel. It's an acronym for the LGBTQIA+ Autistic Research Collective, and it's out of Lincoln Memorial. And we are investigating autistic LGBTQIA+ adults' experiences with access to community, workplace, forming relationships, be it platonic, professional, family relationships, and then romantic and or sexual relationships. And we're using our research to build out recommendations to help with the barriers that they face in those areas. We also have a kink study going on that looks at autistic queer folks and the experiences they have with kink and BDSM. And we're going to use that information from like our surveys and interviews to build out recommendations for better adult 18+ sexual and relational health information. And one of my other jobs is coaching. So I do some coaching with queer clients. That includes like gender diverse individuals. And many are recovering from injuries, recovering from like a life-changing injury that it's going to follow them forever, something chronic, people with mobility issues, or hypermobility concerns, and then of course neurodivergent people. And we do work with forming connections, having sex, and how to have sex that is pleasurable for them, specifically things like BDSM and kink, and making those kink spaces accessible for them, and making sure that it's accessible not just physically, but also with their gender, finding ways that they can feel affirmed in their gender while managing these concerns.
Yeah. Can
Does
you,
someone want me to repeat the acronym? Is that
yes.
what that says?
the laurel?
Laurel, like the laurel leaves, like what the Greeks used to wear. It's spelled just like the plant, but
So-
it's stands for LGBTQIA plus Autistic Research Collective.
Awesome. All right. So what are some of the barriers that are unique to transgender and gender diverse individuals who are also autistic?
So I obviously work with a lot of autistic clients, and most of them, well, no, all of them are adults, but many of them have tried coming out across the lifetime. And it is so hard to be not believed in one aspect or the other of your identity. One aspect being you're trans, so you can't be autistic, or you're autistic, so you can't be trans. And if they come out as trans or gender diverse at a young age, they're infantilized and they're told that they can't possibly know the extent of what it means to have a gender. So a lot of them end up back in the closet or just denied care. And then if they come out as adults, they're told they can't possibly have not known for so long. And now it's a cool thing. So they're faking it to be like the Gen Zers, or they're lying, or they're just seeking attention. So they get denied in yet another way, and they're infantilized and told they, as an autistic person, they can't understand the complexities of gender identity. And it's also different if someone comes out as trans first and they're accepted, and then they later find out that they're autistic, because then they're being questioned about, oh, is this just a mental illness? Is your transness and a mental illness because it's always something with you? Or that's like a really unique thing. It's like they're really damned if they do, damned if they don't. And it can be really hard for some people to hold these identities and not be believed.
Yeah, thank you for expanding on that. So what are some ways that us as OTPs can advocate and support neurodivergent, trans, and gender diverse individuals?
Yeah. So I'm going to just echo what everyone's been saying, which is to believe people when they come out. It can be so scary to come out to a health professional or to correct them. I don't care how client-centered you think your practice is. It's still a power dynamic, and it takes a lot of courage to come out. And even if it's jumbled or weird, or you think it's poorly communicated, believe them. It's really hard. It's really scary. And saying things like, thank you for telling me, thank you for trusting me with this, can go a long way. And take a note out of the autistic handbook. Autistic people will literally script things. They will say, they're going to say this, that person's going to say that. If you have to practice it so you don't go, another one, like, make sure you're trying to be as affirming as possible. Ask them a name, ask them pronouns, and be really open to fluidity, especially if you're working with people that are just unpacking that gender book. Be open to them maybe being, maybe I'll be Jess this week, but I'll be Carly next week, and then I'm going to be Tay in 2 weeks. Be open to being that person that they can feel safe saying, it changed again. Yeah, I know I was they, she this week, but can we try they, them this week? Be open, be be really mindful when you're in session with them, because there is a fluidity, especially with autistic folks. And if you can be that safe person for them, it's going to change their life. Also being really aware of when you have to use, we know it's the system's slow to change. If you have to use their dead name or you have to misgender them on paperwork, giving them a heads up. That's really big, because they're going to probably see it one way or another. And if you don't tell them and they see it, they're going to think that behind closed doors, my OT thinks I'm dead name. And then reassure them, say, I know the system is really slow to change, and I know that this is incorrect. This is what I have to do. And if possible, advocate at your office. Maybe even just starting out with like having the correct gender or name on unofficial documents, like email reminders, or like updates when there's holiday hours or something, just so they can feel affirmed, even if it's super temporary. And if they feel comfortable with you sharing little wins, like celebrate with them. If say they got a shower every day this week, I know that's really pushing it. Celebrate that with them. Don't act like just because you can do it, that they should be able to do it. Like one of my trans guy friends told his therapist about when he got his first beard lineup. I may have said that wrong because I don't know beards well, but he told him, because he was so excited he was going to get the whole hot towel treatment, and his therapist just went, okay. And that can feel so othering. Be that person that can help them feel like everything they're doing is progress.
Thank you. That was so amazing. And just for anyone who's unaware, dead naming is when you use a person's old name or name that they are no longer using. And misgendering is when you purposefully use the wrong gender for somebody. Jess, for your next question, you are a researcher. So what are some of the key takeaways from your research on accessibility for autistic and LGBTQIA individuals?
So I'm gonna just echo some of the things that have already been published, but also the things that are not yet published. I've been working on a lit review, and a systematic review. This is so nerdy, but a systematic review just came out mid-July, and it was a review on suicide and self-harm for trans youth. And some of the really influential factors for suicide and self-harm are so within our reach. They are asking for the ground level to just not feel so out of control. It's things like having at least one adult in a school that makes them feel safe, having social support, using the correct pronouns, using someone's correct name. They're so big, and it's not so big. It's so easy. And these things can be a literal lifesaver. And even like we found that even short-term relationships with clients, like I know there are some OT practice settings where you have one session, you have a really quick in and out with somebody, and even having that really short time using their correct name, their correct pronouns, asking, if it's an adult, asking about sex is so impactful. It really can make them feel heard. It can change their life, and it can help them feel comfortable seeking out future care. And they will also know what OT is, because you remember the people that make you feel the safest, and they will realize that OT is in other places that they can get care from, like gender clinics.
Thank you so much. Thank you for answering all questions. I'm going to hand it back to Bree.
Thank you. Oh, that was amazing, Jess. Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you questions, Deb. So same first question. What is your role in your workplace, and how does the job intersect with caring for transgender and gender diverse individuals?
Well, thank you. What a fun act to follow these three folks who I admire all. So what is my role right now? I just transitioned to a full-time assistant professor role at Ithaca College. So as I shared with you all before it started, my contract hasn't yet started there. So that work is just beginning. But what this work looks like there for me is in the spring, I have the distinct pleasure of creating an entire graduate level course on sexuality and intimacy in OT. So I'm extremely excited for that. For those of you that know Dr. Unko, they were the last person to teach that course. And so I get a chance to create my own version and hopefully do them some justice. So that's what that work looks like formally in education. I'd love to echo what everyone else has said of just providing affirmation in everyday life. So for when that comes as a professor for students, that looks like me sharing my pronouns, giving open space for students to share their pronouns if they're ready for that. Also making sure that it's a safe space for people to trial names like we've all discussed, that they can show up to the classroom as whoever they want to be that day, and that's perfectly okay with me. So that's what the work looks like on the education side. In the OT clinical practice side, as Tay and Jess shared, I have several jobs. So I work at two local skilled nursing facilities and also the local hospital that services a pretty large area. So we get a diverse number of people with a diverse number of conditions or experiences. And as everyone else has alluded to, trans and gender diverse folks, as we do, exist in all spaces. So at times, unfortunate things happen to any person, which will land them in the hospital or skilled nursing facility. So the work there in terms of with peers, I see I actually have some coworkers here tonight, which makes me feel really supported and proud. So what that looks like in the workplace is providing in-service education if you are willing. I'm always going to say things that I'm willing to do, and that's not at all expecting that out of any of you folks. I totally understand the burden of being that token person. So if you're willing to do the work, hats off to you. So for me, just recently provided an in-service at the hospital talking about just baseline LGBT plus terms to lay out the groundwork, and then also what that looks like for OT, PT, and speech in that environment, bringing in language of binding and tucking practices. I did see that there was a question about guidance on binding and tucking. There's not yet a formal OT document, hint, with some information guiding those practices that will be out soon, right, Bree? However, we can take, a lot of what I will speak on is from my own lived experience or lived experience that's shared from others, because not all human experience is available in scientific data yet. So looking what's available and providing and sharing that information, really providing education on the importance of affirming pronouns, and just kind of going through those things in both of those environments to bring that language in, and also to encourage and support my peers in being allies and accomplices when it comes to the work, especially because I spend a little bit of time everywhere. I'm not always there for consultation or there when, these topics arise. So making sure that they feel equipped to either address some things or differ when needed.
Thank you, Dev. And yes, thanks for also shouting out the work that's being done. There is a webpage coming out soon that will have some of those topics. So thanks. So next question. You mentioned that you work in hospital and skilled nursing facilities. What are some unique challenges that you've seen for transgender, gender diverse older adults, and how can OTs practitioners help minimize those challenges?
Sure. Yeah, I think there are shared experiences. There are also some unique experiences in being an older adult. I think we can all reflect on, life is definitely hard for transgender and gender diverse folks in today's day and age in the United States, but it was also very difficult in different ways years before. And so in skilled nursing and hospital settings where I do work with mostly adult and geriatric populations, there have been several instances where, this isn't an opportunity, or someone is coming to an amalgamation of things happen where someone is maybe realizing kind of what their identity is at a very late point in their life. And there could be a lot of things that lead to maybe holding off so long on addressing those things. Or I don't love using the term coming out, because I think that that perpetuates the expectation that we have to tell other people who we are. I prefer to refer to as letting others in, and that the individual chooses when they share the information with folks. So there are a lot of folks, especially in today's age, that feel a lot safer or have maybe environments that didn't exist before, where they are starting to let other people into something that's pretty massive for them. I myself can understand what it's like to live 16 years hiding who I am, and I can't imagine what it's like to do that for 70 years. So as people have mentioned, I exist very openly and very proudly in the spaces that I work in. That's a part of my own activism, and doing that creates a space that allows a lot of those conversations to happen. Or maybe, you know, I've even had patients kind of start to request me as a therapist so that they feel comfortable in that realm. So as everyone has said, I like to think a lot of my role is a support role. I'm not the person here saving the day, but I can support someone with language, support them with that safe environment, and then also bring that information, as everyone else has shared, to the team if that's necessary. I don't ever share anything without consent. So there are instances where someone will share something with me, but not want that shared with the other team. So just making sure that I am unwavering and providing a safe and open space for all people. Sometimes gender and sexuality comes into play. Sometimes it's just other things. But yeah, I hope that answers the question partially.
Yes, it does. Thank you. Just wanted to dive a little bit deeper into that. Are there any certain assessments that you use or theories, especially when you're working with transgender and gender diverse adults?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I use any most consistently. I think there's the occupational performance inventory of sexuality and intimacy, but that leans a little bit more into the intimacy side of it. I do use that at times with just opening a conversation. There's a screening process. There's a big self-reflection assessment portion of it. And that is tied to, I believe it's the occupational therapy sexual assessment framework. So if I'm using something kind of formally, that's what I pull from. A lot of times with adult and elderly populations, especially with dementia that are trans or gender diverse, there's a lot of consideration, as Carly mentioned, with sensory integration and sensory aspects. That plays a huge role. I think for me, the biggest portion that was also mentioned is that occupational profile, and going back to consent in adult and elderly populations. There seems to be a lot of lack of consent in just being able to getting consent to touch someone's body. And I see it often in skilled nursing in terms of grooming and hygiene and dressing, where we'll see maybe someone who presents with a female body, and nursing staff or even OT staff may want to shave that person without their consent. And a lot of my education as an OT is educating on consent and just asking that person, do you want to keep your facial hair? Is this how you like to present? Or, how can we change this to make you feel more like you? In the hospital and in skilled nursing, I would say it starts off with really simple things. As an OT, I come in and say, do you want to keep this gown on? Or would you like to put clothes on that make me feel more like yourself? Or how can I make you feel more human today? Is this the best name to call you? Or is there another name I can use for you that feels more like you? A lot of it is just as simple as asking with a question. People are going to work with you at whatever level they're comfortable with. But if you give them the space to do that, they'll take the space when they're ready to do that. So I think a lot of the work is not making it feel different, but being steadfast in giving that space for people to have an option in how they want to navigate their body. It's not uncommon that it's someone's first chance to let others in when they are in a skilled nursing facility, and then working with staff of how can we support this person still being their whole self. That has looked like creating dating profiles for people, that has looked like exploring, sexuality, intimacy, and toys, that has looked like exploring different names, exploring different pronouns. So it really is, it's not necessarily different, but I don't want to shy away from the experiences that adult and elderly folks have had, in the world, specifically in the United States. I use the term queer for myself. That's not the term that I use first with those populations, because it does have a historical derogatory use of it. So just being cognizant of some of those historical implications, but also being cognizant of they're just another person that's trying to be a human, and making sure that I give them space to do that and whatever that looks like for them.
Thank you, Deb. That's a lot of great advice that you just gave. So you mentioned working in an interdisciplinary team and maybe some other staff members not being as affirming. How do you advocate for your clients when you might see something like that and educate maybe other team members?
Part of it is kind of what Carly noted of bringing in that science research, right? We are a evidence-based practice profession, so the evidence does exist. So I like to throw in that research at people just because you can't deny the facts. I think the other part of it, and again, I would not expect this out of every person, but for me, I feel empowered when I get to advocate or be an activist in those realms. So I'm super happy to have those conversations. I'm super happy to be pulled into those conversations. I also find it really important to equip my coworkers that don't exist as a transgender or gender diverse folk with the tools they need to have those conversations, especially when I'm not around. I think we're all collectively tired from doing the work every day. So I like to pass off that burden a little bit when it's possible. So I do that a lot through education and services that I'm willing to give, giving people language or so examples of how they can make the workplace more inclusive for all. My current project at the hospital is having everyone wear pronoun pins or a pronoun badge, that all bathrooms in the hospital will be just bathrooms that are not labeled with a gender. So kind of helping recruit staff members to make that change too.
Thank you, Dev. And then we're going to go ahead and open up the Q&A for questions. You can ask all of the panelists. So we have about the last 10 minutes to do so. So I'll go ahead and hand it off to Lily.
Yeah, thank you so much. The first one I'm going to answer and just read it is that this counts for contact hours, and we will be sending out a confirmation email within the next week or so. And then the first question for the panelists, with all the different jobs you guys have and everything you've seen, what gaps in research and treatment do you feel like the future of OT can start to address and explore?
I would love personally, I know there was a question about resources about chest binders. And this is something that I was so desperately looking for last year when I started my job. I would love more research about just related to chest binders in general, but all like other like equipment or things like that, as far as for affirming gender, about short and long-term effects, both on physical and mental health, would be great. I do have a resource that I made last year that I can make available in addition to what Bree had talked about, but across so many things, having the things that we see every day, like anecdotally, like represented in the research, as far as like the impacts of these small affirmations, and the impact of social and physical transition on mental health, we need more of it.
That's sort of exactly where I was going to go, especially people that have so I see a lot of autistic clients, and binders are just not an option. It's too hard to breathe. A lot of people have asthma, and that is not a great thing to wear long term. So everyone turns to, not everyone, a lot of people turn to trans tape. And you can have an adhesive allergy and not know, and just think you're having like a heat rash, or you're, I don't know, you just peeled it off wrong. We need a lot more research on what it looks like when you have worn trans tape incorrectly, or how to be healing a wound from binding incorrectly with tape, because it is so painful, and it almost looks like some of these horrible wounds you get from burns. And there's not a lot of good ways to then bind while healing a wound and trying to figure out what works for you. So that's a big area. Plus, we need things like packers and how to not have friction burns. I don't do phys jizz, can you tell? that kind of stuff. The different gender affirming tools we do have sometimes come with all kinds of rubbing, friction, and pain, and we really need more information on that. Oh, and for fat folks, because people that live in larger bodies really struggle with that kind of stuff.
I was also going to say there's room, I think, for going back and exploring a lot of the research that's already been done in both occupational therapy and occupational science, because so much of what has been done was extremely gendered in the way it was conducted previous to now. And so I think there's room for a lot of exploration of, okay, if we're trying to get out of this like gender binary that influenced a lot of the research, or like even if we're getting to like larger topics of like patriarchy that's influenced a lot of the research, I think there's a lot of room to re-explore some of the research that's been done as well too.
Thank you. The next question is about if you can repeat the formal assessments regarding sexuality and intimacy.
Yeah, it's OPC. That's how I say it. I don't know if that's how everybody else says it, but it's the Occupational Performance Inventory of Sexuality and Intimacy.
And then we have a question for sensory ideas. They work at a children's hospital with a gender health program. Do you guys have any resources for sensory strategies for youth receiving gender affirming care?
I would say it's hard. It's hard to know without knowing the individual, right? And I think that maybe was the answer other people wanted to give. I think, again, I think doing a sensory profile, even if it's not like a full one or a formal one, would be really helpful. And then going from there and exploring like what are the aspects of gender affirming care that this person is or is not pursuing, because it might not necessarily have anything to do with physical aspects. It could just be the things we talked about too, of like, hey, I want to be called this name. But I think a sensory profile, even if it's just a really basic, like 10 minutes, like let's go through XYZ questions, can give you a lot of information about where to go from there.
Also the community, see if there's any community in your area. I know a lot of autistic trans folks in the area that I'm in Boston, have a shared Google Sheets, and it's everyone that knows it puts in if they're like sensitive to pressure, to fabric, and then everyone that does have that binder will put in their feelings towards it. Like some binders are just way too scratchy, some bind way too much. I know I have asthma, so I can't wear certain kinds of binders. So people also will have a separate tab for sports bras. So the queer community has always been really self-reliant. So if there is a community, seeing if the community has resources, because we're pretty ingenious. We have done this for a while, and if you can lean on resources that already exist, that's great.
And I think it's also important to just reiterate that, considering sensory experiences for people that are gender diverse or experiencing gender affirming care, it's not any different than any other case, right? So if the person, doesn't like tight-fitting things, then you would navigate the same way you would navigate that with someone else. If they don't like tags on their clothing, you would navigate that the same way as you would with someone else. So I think part of what we're all trying to say is it's not always different. Like you should consider the whole aspect of the person, but sensory integration is sensory integration. So just kind of going through the same process, maybe with that identity included is important.
All right, thank you, everyone. I think we have time for one more question. Do you feel as though advocating for clients who are exploring their gender identity is different and or more difficult at different points in the life stage?
Yeah, I'm happy to pop off on that quick. Sorry, Tay, if I cut you off. I think that there are different experiences. I think a lot of what Tay and Jess and Carly had talked about is I see a lot. I don't work as much with youth and adolescents, but there's a lot of like, you're too young to understand your body. So that's a huge barrier for those folks. Also, kind of what Jess got at is with adult and older populations, it's like, well, how are you just finding this out now? Or is this real? Or is this related to just mental health? Because how could someone possibly not, know who they are when they have known who they are? They just haven't had the material, space, or language to verbalize that. So I do think there are nuances to it because of that, but I wouldn't say that's based on their age. I would just say that's based on like society and systems doing what they do to those age groups with the queerness included in that.
I think environment also plays a huge role in that sort of exploration as well. Like I've worked in many a school in the greater Boston area, and the school I'm at now versus one of the schools I was at 4 or 5 years ago. 4 or 5 years ago, and this is, I think, more the school than necessarily it being 4 or 5 years ago. Like, no students would have come out because the environment was not very conducive to that at that point, versus the school I'm at now, we really actively work hard to make it a safer environment. And I think that plays a big role in the fact that I think something like 15 to 20% of our students identify as or are some letter of LGBTQIA. And so we've got a huge population. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we work hard to create the safer space. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. I know we went a little bit over. We want to thank all the panelists for participating today. It was super awesome to hear from everybody. Everyone had really great things to say. And also we want to thank the DEI JAB committee for hosting with us. I'm going to switch over to my slide. And we also just want to promote that we will have a transgender and gender diverse inclusive resource coming up soon with AOTA. Bree and I are both very excited about it. It is our capstone project. Thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you in the next panel.
Just one more last thing. If you had any other questions, feel free to contact Varlisha at bgibbs@aota.org if you have any other questions or resource requests. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.